You don't feel empty because you failed. You feel empty because you understand too much. You know what people want before they say it. You know what they're hiding behind jokes. You know when they're pretending, and worse, you know when you are. Bukowski said it clean. Sadness is caused by intelligence. The more you understand certain things, the more you wish you didn't. But this isn't depression. It's not even despair. It's something more subtle and more dangerous. Lucid detachment. Stay through to the end, because this kind of sadness doesn't need to be healed. It needs to be weaponized. It begins innocently, an above-average ability to connect dots. You don't just hear what someone says, you hear what they don't say. You notice the shifts in eye contact, the strained timing of their laugh, the microsecond where a compliment turns into a performance. And you tell yourself, this is an advantage. You can read a room. You can spot manipulation. You know when people are trying too hard to hide something. At first, it's thrilling, like having night vision while everyone else is stumbling in the dark. You think, I can use this. But there's a point where this pattern recognition turns into something darker. You stop using it and start being used by it. The same intelligence that makes you aware starts to strip away your ability to experience. You can no longer be present in a conversation without mentally mapping the subtext. You can't receive kindness without wondering what it costs. You can't relax in a moment without interrogating whether you're performing. The superpower becomes a surveillance system, always scanning, always breaking things down, always evaluating who's real and who's posturing. It's not arrogance, it's erosion, because the more you see, the less you can believe. You stop trusting warmth, you stop trusting joy, you stop trusting anyone who doesn't seem conflicted. And worst of all, you stop trusting yourself. Because this kind of intelligence doesn't just look outward, it turns inward. It scrutinizes your own motives, your reactions, your needs. Why did I laugh just now? Was that genuine? Was I trying to manipulate? Am I being honest or just strategic? You become so attuned to subtext that the surface starts to feel fake by default. And once that happens, the entire world loses its texture. People talk and you hear templates. People smile and you see compliance. People open up and you question the timing. This is where the suffering begins, not in failure, but in functionality. You still go to events. You still maintain friendships. You still participate in life. But underneath it all, there's a low hum of detachment. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much to keep lying to yourself. And so you withdraw, not physically, emotionally, cognitively. You don't disconnect because you're antisocial. You disconnect because your brain won't stop interpreting. You're not broken, you're just over-calibrated. Bukowski called it sadness, but what he meant was overexposure to motives, to masks, to everything people think they're hiding, but aren't. This is where intelligence ceases to be a gift and becomes the burden of seeing clearly without the tools to shut it off. Not yet. Clarity kills enchantment. This is the part they never warn you about. The part where intelligence doesn't make you smarter, it makes you less reachable. Not because you're distant, but because everything close starts to feel staged. You don't watch a movie. You predict the emotional arc. You don't listen to a compliment. You detect the subtext. You don't fall into love. You measure the rhythm of its construction. It's not cynicism. It's exposure. Because emotional precision comes with a penalty. You lose access to comfort that isn't honest. And most comfort is anything but. You try to enjoy things. You really do. You go on the date. You play along with the joke. You sit through the conversation, but something feels synthetic. Something behind the smile says, this isn't what they actually feel, and your body knows it, long before your thoughts do. So you start searching for people who won't make you decode them, for moments that don't feel like rehearsals, for environments that don't reward performance over presence. But those places are rare, and those people are rarer. And the smarter you are, the more acute your radar becomes, which means the more dissonance you pick up, which means the harder it is to stay present. And so you adapt. You withdraw without leaving. You detach without warning. You pretend without lying. You perform just enough to stay included, but never enough to feel anything real. And here's the trap. You don't feel miserable. You feel fine, functional, capable, neutral. But it's not neutrality. It's grief, filtered through intelligence, because you've developed the capacity to see emotional truth, but not the capacity to rest in it. You can name what others avoid. You can point to the contradiction in their eyes. You can describe the pain they won't admit, but you can't feel your own without dissecting it. You don't cry. You analyze the conditions that would lead someone to cry. You don't rage. You observe the repressed impulse beneath the rage. This is what intelligence does when it's unbalanced. It turns emotion into something clinical, not to protect you from feeling, but to protect you from the loss of control that comes with feeling. And eventually, you forget the difference between understanding and healing. You think insight is progress. You think diagnosis is resolution. You think naming the wound is the same as processing it. But it's not. It's another mask, another performance, another way to stay safe. Bukowski's sadness wasn't just a symptom of intellect. It was the price of truth. The more you understand certain things, like how love is often imitation, how happiness is often marketed, how most vulnerability is rehearsed, the more you wish you didn't. Not because it's wrong, but because it makes joy harder to trust. And in that hesitation, you become the man who watches life. Instead of living it, you don't look broken. You show up on time. You meet expectations. You know when to nod, when to laugh, when to agree. Everyone thinks you're doing well. You're composed, polite, even helpful. But what they don't see is that every action feels like choreography. Every sentence is filtered. Every reaction is calculated for effect, not expression. Because when intelligence mixes with pain, you don't explode. You compensate. You become high functioning, not because you're healed, but because you're efficient at hiding your fragmentation. And people love it. They reward your control. They praise your maturity. They admire your emotional independence. What they don't realize is that you're performing sanity, not feeling it. You're reconstructing normalcy, brick by brick, because letting anyone see the collapse inside you feels worse than collapse itself. This isn't numbness. This is simulation. You're not absent, you're over-present, too aware, too careful, too controlled. You replay conversations after they end. You rehearse how to say, "I'm fine," so it lands as believable. You manage expressions like a diplomat. It's exhausting, but it's also safe. Because the alternative, letting someone see what's really going on, means risking a level of rejection that would confirm every private fear, that you're too much, too sharp, too strange, too sad in ways others don't have language for. So you keep the mask, not out of deception, out of mercy for yourself and for them. Because if they knew what you were really thinking, if they saw how hollow the applause felt, if they sensed how little joy reached you, they wouldn't know what to do with it. So you spare them, and in doing so, you disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, a slow subtraction of self. You still function, you still succeed, but inside you are folding inward, like a house staged for guests that no one ever visits. This is what Bukowski meant. Not that intelligence causes sadness, but that it demands a performance of non-sadness to keep the illusion of control alive. And the smarter you are, the better you get at convincing everyone, including yourself, that the show is the self. But it's not. It's the costume. And eventually, something small, an offhand comment, a forgotten invitation, a moment of misunderstood silence, will break the spell, and you'll realize how far you've drifted from your own emotion, how well you've trained yourself not to need comfort, how dangerous it is to be functional when you're slowly eroding beneath the surface. Bukowski didn't break down. He bled out over time, through poems, through silence, through a quiet war with meaning. You don't need to shatter to be broken. Sometimes you just need to go one more day unnoticed. One more day being applauded for the very mask that's killing you. There's a type of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being untranslatable. You try to share what you see, how social interactions feel scripted, how words rarely match emotion, how most people mistake noise for connection. But every attempt to explain it sounds like you're being difficult, or arrogant, or cold. So eventually, you stop trying. Not because you don't want to be understood, but because the act of explaining makes the isolation worse. It's not that they disagree, it's that they don't even see the problem. And that's when the fracture becomes permanent. You stop expecting to be met. You lower the bar of communication. You start answering, "How are you?" with "busy." You smile on cue. You mirror what's safe. You camouflage your inner world so well, it begins to vanish. And they applaud you for it. They call you easygoing, balanced, low maintenance. But the truth is, you're just digesting your sadness in private. Because externalizing it feels like a risk no one's equipped to carry. You become a translator with no audience, fluent in silence, articulate in withdrawal. You keep your metaphors to yourself. You say, "I'm tired," when you mean, "I haven't felt real in weeks." You say, "Yeah, all good," when you mean, "I'm drowning in unspoken grief." Not because you're lying, but because truth feels heavier than most people can hold without misusing it. This is the cost of internal complexity. Not superiority, invisibility. Your depth makes you quiet. Not because you have nothing to say, but because very few conversations deserve the truth you've built in solitude. So you speak less. You shrink the aperture of expression. You edit yourself in real time, not to deceive, but to survive. And when you finally do speak honestly, when the filters come off for even a second, you feel exposed, like you've violated some unspoken rule of superficial intimacy. And the people around you, they blink, they change the subject, they remind you you're too much for them. Bukowski's sadness wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative, the result of thousands of minor dismissals, thousands of moments where his perception had no landing place. And it builds, not into rage, not into tears, but into a kind of spiritual muteness. You start believing that connection is a privilege reserved for the less complicated. That simplicity is the ticket to belonging. That in order to be loved, you must first become easier to understand. But what if that's not true? What if this loneliness isn't punishment? What if it's the territory of the few who refuse to dilute themselves? What if the sadness doesn't mean something's wrong with you, but that you haven't yet met the ones who speak your language? Because they exist, but they won't find you if you keep hiding behind what fits. There's a quiet moment sometime after the pretending wears thin when you realize you've been mourning the wrong thing. You haven't been mourning the loss of people, or relationships, or ease. You've been mourning the loss of belonging inside their world, a world that never really had space for your kind of mind. Because what if you were never meant to be normal? What if your refusal to lie to yourself, to others, to the scripts society feeds you isn't a flaw? What if it's a signal? Bukowski didn't glamorize sadness, he excavated it. Not to wallow, but to expose what the world buries. He understood that certain types of perception disqualify you from fitting in. That once you see how shallow most of it is, You can't unsee it. You stop being able to participate in rituals you no longer believe in. And then people start calling you difficult, disconnected, dark. But you're not dark. You're honest in ways that make others uncomfortable, because most people don't want truth. They want reinforcement. They want your silence to validate their choices. They want your smile to confirm their illusion. And when you stop playing along, they leave. Or worse, they label you broken. But here's what they don't know. There's a difference between being broken and being unwilling to be fake. You weren't built for small talk and simulated feelings. You weren't designed to climb ladders you don't believe in. You weren't put here to become palatable. Your mind is wired for patterns, for contradiction, for exposing things that others spend their whole lives avoiding. And yes, that kind of perception comes with sadness, but not because you're weak, because your body knows the weight of too much truth. And you carried it anyway. That isn't dysfunction, that's discipline. That's what makes you dangerous in a world addicted to comfort. You don't need permission to feel deeply. You don't need to apologize for what you can't unknow. And you definitely don't need to soften so others can feel safe around your sharpness. This isn't a call to arrogance. It's a reminder that the very thing making you feel out of place is the thing that will set you apart. You don't need more friends, you need mirrors. People who don't just tolerate your mind, but reverberate with it. People who hear what you're not saying and don't flinch. Until then, don't fold. Don't perform normalcy just to be accepted by the emotionally limited. Don't shrink your vision so others feel tall. Don't betray your sadness. It's the receipt for everything you've had the courage to see. You were never meant to be normal, and that means you were never meant to be easily loved. But when the right ones find you, they'll know you by your sadness, because theirs will speak the same language. Most men try to fix their sadness. They treat it like a virus, something to purge, suppress, medicate, or outgrow. But not Bukowski. He let it sit. He let it smoke itself out in silence. He let it become a second skin, not because he enjoyed it, but because he knew what it really was. Not a flaw, not a weakness, not a sign of failure, but a signal. Because sadness, when it's born of perception, isn't dysfunction. It's direction. It tells you what you're no longer willing to lie about. It tells you which rooms make you fake yourself. It tells you which relationships require the slow erosion of your truth. And if you listen, really listen, that sadness becomes something most men never access: self-definition. The sadness you feel when you understand too much isn't the enemy. It's the part of you that refuses to go back to sleep. It's the inner voice saying, I will not betray myself for comfort. I will not simplify my truth to fit someone else's peace. I will not put on the costume of a happy man if it means silencing the man I actually am. This kind of sadness is sacred because it comes after illusion collapses and before rebirth begins. It means you've survived the death of what you thought life was supposed to be. And now you get to ask the real question. If not that, then what? Not the scripted marriage, not the status-based success, not the smiles that hide obligation. Something else, something authored, something real. But that won't come from numbing the sadness. It comes from carrying it, from walking with it into conversations you used to fake, from sitting in rooms you used to perform in and not saying a word, from letting people misunderstand you and not correcting them because you no longer need to be seen by those who refuse to look. This is the turning point. The sadness that once disoriented you becomes your compass. You follow it, not because it's pleasant, but because it doesn't lie. It tells you when a room isn't meant for you. It tells you when your presence is being tolerated, not respected. It tells you when your silence is safer than your honesty, and dares you to speak anyway. Most men spend their lives trying to escape this weight. You carry it. And that's what separates you, not because you're stronger, but because you're done pretending. This isn't a phase. This isn't depression. This isn't something to overcome. It's a threshold. You've outgrown the world that told you to smile while bleeding. And now you're not asking to be healed. You're asking to be whole. You didn't watch this video to feel better. You watched it because some part of you was tired of pretending, tired of hiding your intelligence under false humility, tired of folding your perception just to keep others comfortable, tired of being the man who sees everything but is seen by no one. That sadness you carry, it isn't a disease, it's the consequence of depth. It's the bruise left by truth in a world that rewards illusion. And you're not here to escape it. You're here to understand what it's made of. Not to dissolve the pain, but to trace it back to its source. Not to numb your mind, but to anchor it. Because the more you understand, the more you realize how much of your life was built on unconscious compliance. How much of your identity was a mask designed to be accepted. How much of your silence was a transaction, trading truth for inclusion. But that trade is over now. There is no going back to comfort once clarity arrives. There is no safety in rituals you've already exposed. There is no home in people who only love your distortion. And maybe you won't find new belonging right away. Maybe your perception will still cost you connection. Maybe you'll still feel the ache of complexity in a world that demands simplicity. But at least now, you'll know it's not your fault. You'll know the sadness isn't dysfunction. You'll know the solitude isn't exile, it's sovereignty. Because the more you understand, the more it hurts. But the more it hurts, the closer you are to something no one can fake: integrity. Now sit with this. What part of you have you been hiding to appear functional? And what would happen if you let that part breathe?